Hi there, and thanks for the introduction, Kelly, and welcome to our panel. What can we learn from open banking for open energy and other open initiatives? For those that don't know me, I'm Faith Reynolds, and for the last 3 years I've been advising the Open Banking Implementation Entity on how we can design the open banking standard to deliver good consumer outcomes. Now I'm working with Gavin and Miles and others to take what we've learned from open banking and to apply it to open energy, with a particular focus on the governance and trust framework in the energy sector, where the data sets being shared are different, the organisations involved are different, and the use cases for data are different too. So what, if anything, have we learned? And as we open up data, what does the future landscape look like? So I've got a great panel joining us today. Gavin joins us, maybe give us a wave, Gavin. Join us from Icebreaker One. Gavin is a serial entrepreneur with specific expertise in data and how using it can create positive impact. So he's the founding CEO of the Open Data Institute, the world's leading institute for open innovation with data. And in 2015, at the request of Treasury, he also co-chaired the development of the Open Banking Standard, laying the foundations for regulation and catalysing international innovation. Gavin's more recently founded Icebreaker One to empower decision makers to mandate, measure and act upon the data flows that enable net zero, unlocking the data infrastructure needed to create a continuous flow of evidence that informs action. Miles, maybe you want to give a wave as well. Miles has worked on the cutting edge of technology with some of the largest mobile operators before turning to the opportunities presented by FinTech. I worked with him at Open Banking, where he was head of propositions since its inception as well. He was there right at the beginning, and he's been responsible for understanding the consumer and business needs and ensuring that the exciting technology delivers the competitive societal and consumer benefits envisaged by the CMA that kick-started open banking. He's now leading on shared data propositions for Icebreaker One and creating the infrastructure that will hasten the drive to net zero and unleashing the opportunity. So Simon, if you can give us a wave. Simon is head of ecosystem engagement at Open Banking, and he leads the engagement to grow the ecosystem as a whole and to carry out awareness raising across multiple industries regarding open banking. He's recently been instrumental in the adoption of open banking by UK government and continues to help grow the ecosystem. He previously led a TPP through the accreditation for AIS and PISP called Slide by Business and a consumer cash flow app. He's previously spent 20 years at the Co-op Bank, and Simon delivered the first social banking account for vulnerable adults under local authority care. And he's got lots of experience working with local authorities, also with one of the trade bodies for credit unions in the sector, looking at digital and improving digital delivery. Harriet also joins us. Harriet, away from you too. Harriet's an economic advisor at the Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, where she's leading on the very important Smart Data initiative. And this policy aims to increase competition and improve consumer outcomes by accelerating the development and use of data portability in sectors beyond banking. So if you haven't looked at this, I would recommend you look at it. It's effectively saying, how can we do open banking in other sectors like telecoms and energy? Harriet was previously at the National Infrastructure Commission and Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So that's our panel introduced. I'm going to go straight into questions. So Gavin, I'm going to start with you. You helped create the Open Data Institute. You were instrumental in kickstarting open banking, and now you're running open energy. It would be brilliant if you could just share your vision for what a data-driven economy looks like, and perhaps some of the things that you've learned on the way.
Super. Thank you, Faith. I think here really at the heart of this is how we deal with data in the 21st century, when we've got a wealth of experience built up over decades of both development on the internet and development of the web. But I still think there's a lot of reluctance to really embrace data as something that is a continuous flow of evidence that informs action in a way that is really material to the financial markets and other forms of decision making. I think quite often data is still seen as a technology, or at least a technology problem. And there's lots of calls to invest in data science and invest in the sort of mechanics and lots of jargon like AI and machine learning and blockchain and so on that tend to get in the way of what we're actually going to do with this information as we get access to it. And I think there's a lot of differences in the business model that can help us understand how we can better unlock access to data by thinking of a slightly different model. A lot of our historical economic development has been about accumulating assets into one place and then working out how we can charge kind of rents to exploit the assets we've collated. Data is very different in that it is infinitely copyable. So its value increases the more it's connected. So if we start with how can we increase the number of connections to data, effectively reduce the friction in transactions in order to access information, then we have a different way of thinking about how we're going to access this continuous flow of evidence, and really focusing on use cases. And open banking in particular has been very effective because it had a very narrow use case to really focus people's minds on what the challenges were. And I think, as we've discovered, the challenges are not technological. They are the rules, the rights, the policy frameworks, the regulatory frameworks, the liability frameworks that really help us provide access to sensitive information. And so one of the things we've been working on is arriving at very clear language to help us understand what we call the data spectrum. So rather than talking about big data or personal data, we talk about whether or not data is open, shared, or closed. And open data is very straightforward. It's data that anyone can use for any purpose for free. Obviously, that doesn't apply to your personal bank statements and never should do. So that would come under the category of what we call shared data, where there are effectively preemptive rights defined through the open banking standard, whereby an entire market can have permission to access and consent to access in a controlled and secure framework. And then at the other end of the spectrum, at the closed end, is really where we say, actually, that's just bilateral contracts, which is the way that we've worked for the last decades on point-to-point contracts for particular applications. So the particular area of interest for us is really around what we call shared data, is how can we provide many-to-many access, so increase this number of connections with as little friction in the system as possible. So I'll pass back to you there, Faith.
Thanks, Gavin. Really helpful opener. And so, Harriet, just coming to you. So obviously energy is an entirely different sector to banking, and telecoms is different again. Just listening to Gavin talk about sort of actually some of the challenges aren't technological. What are the benefits of thinking about data from a macro level?
Yeah, sure. So we actually consulted as government on smart data and stuff, like how you can extend open banking to other sectors in summer of 2019 now. And a lot of the feedback that we got was emphasizing that data is different in different sectors, and data portability as a result could look very different. So I think that is important to note, but at the same time there are a lot of aspects which can be similar. So the technical infrastructure, for example, from open banking. So I think there's a need to sort of look at both the commonalities and the differences when you're sort of looking at how to introduce these types of initiatives. But in terms of the benefits from sort of commonalities across sectors in particular, it's mainly that it will better enable interoperability. So I know, Gavin, you spoke there about enabling more connections between data, and if you can enable these connections not just within a sector but across sectors as well, as benefits for the users as the improved user experience, but also those third parties offering services and being able to operate in different sectors as well. So a few examples maybe of the cross-sector innovations which we talk about in smart data are sort of improved access to affordable credit, so being able to use things like your utility bills to help when you've got a thin credit file. Some other examples are just better debt advice and management across all sectors, and then a third example which links well with sort of your work on open energy here is around carbon footprint monitoring and management. So being able to sort of use data on your carbon impact and use that to help inform your choice of shops, utility providers, your investments, the products you buy, and so on. So I think that's something that we see from a smart data perspective as the real benefit of this. It's where those cross-sector innovations can be developed.
Thanks, Harriet, and interesting to start thinking about some of those use cases. And just, Simon, from an open banking perspective, where do you see value in opening up other data sets? What kinds of opportunities do you see on the horizon?
Thanks, Faith. It's very, very interesting. If we take open banking in isolation, it's the first time that we've taken one of our traditional industries and actually aggregated it. We've allowed people to take data and put data from our banks next to something else, and we've set a precedent. There's a critical point there about where that will lead us to, because I think in open banking what we've learned is a lot of the things that we thought would happen have actually worked in different directions. The first huge signs of adoption that have got bigger consumer benefits are actually coming from our own government. They're actually coming from departments that we didn't really anticipate that growth coming from, first of all. So if we take aggregation first of all, if we look at it across energy, we can get some very, very quick wins. And the first one, the most obvious one, is people paying penal tariffs. So we can manage to get data to look at their affordability, to make greater, more accurate assessments on them, to look at the tariffs they're on, look at their geolocation, see where they are, and give them a better billing experience and maybe put them back in society to work. We move to medium term, and I think number one, we can take some guesses. I think that's the best thing we can do as well. But we start then to get the chance to be able to put further data next to people, and that's what's happened with an open banking. We're seeing a lot of people put location data, people put additional financial information, additional information about, for instance, we saw Netflix information used last week to calculate people's creditworthiness. Is a great example of showing that somebody can pay something. That's the kind of sidelines we'll see in the medium term. And I think what we'll see there as well is we'll see people aggregating data from multiple sources within energy to give benefits that we don't yet know. So we know we've got to pay for it. So could we potentially have forward purchasing of energy? Could we potentially have different tariffs across different regions? Could we look at that on affordability? Could we have seasonal behaviours? They're all very, very much traditional banking behaviours. But the really big picture, if we compare it to open banking, if we look right on the horizon, we're effectively building a sandbox. The biggest lesson that's come from me from open banking is the ability of the ecosystem. Now, we've delivered change in open banking with UK government, with some other industries as well. And what we found is that their ability to change, their pace, their accuracy, and the way they can work in the ecosystem really, really defeats the traditional big tech providers. So for the consumer, we have a lot of benefits. There'll be faster, more accurate, richer services come to market. And the only reason we can do that is because the data is open. The more data sets we put on top of open banking as a start point, and then we look at energy, and we look at telco, and we look at taxis, we look whatever we want to look at, the stronger those data sets become, we build a brand new ecosystem of technological advancement. And that's a sandbox. Where those people build from at that point and what they actually deliver, it is so exciting. Go right back to the start again. It starts with aggregation. We've got to open up first of all, and when we do that, the steps just become prescribed for us by a very, very exciting and capable population.
Oh, that was really enthusiastic exploration of some of those use cases. Miles, I've got to bring you in here because obviously you are, close to open banking, close to open energy. Can you kind of delve a bit more, perhaps, into the Icebreaker One use case?
Yeah, of course. Just building on what Simon was just saying, actually, when we started out on the journey building open banking, we had a sort of good idea about what we thought people would do with it. But in reality, if we now look back at what's been delivered by the ecosystem that Simon's talking about, it's mind-blowing. And I expect the same kind of impact from open energy. So what we're doing in open energy is looking at how we can open up data sharing across that ecosystem, basically doing the same thing. And in doing so, unlock efficiencies for the energy system, savings for the consumer, decarbonize faster. And within that, we can start to see where there's some real opportunity for interoperability, particularly with open banking. And a few things that I think stand out as problems to be solved. Quite topical. The current the announcement today about the electric vehicles and phasing out of petrol and diesel. One of the big challenges with electric vehicles, range anxiety, being able to find a charger and to pay for it. That's quite a fragmented landscape. And we've been working and talking with the Office for Low Emission Vehicles and understanding what the issues are faced by some of those charge point providers, talking to those providers themselves. And we can see that there are opportunities for bringing in both open energy and open banking services. So, for example, in a kind of, you can imagine things like find a charge point, charge up and pay for it, all on a single platform that starts to break down some of what is now, at the moment, a very fragmented landscape. So that opens up possibilities around shared data in the energy side and payment initiation services on the open banking side, and that to me feels like it could be an area where there's a lot of synergy and a great opportunity for open banking and open energy to work side by side. We've seen other things. There's a massive opportunity that I was only talking to Simon about a few weeks ago in suspense accounts in energy operators. If they are using open banking enabled services to pay, then if that were linked to their energy account, then how would you be able to then match the payer against the account? And that could release a lot of money which is held in suspense accounts at the moment. I believe well over £1 billion sitting there right now. So there's a problem to be solved, and I think this is the kind of thing the ecosystem could go for. And then I can see other things in the area of vulnerable customers. We've seen some very interesting things come about in open banking, through the Open Up 2020 challenge, which was run by Nesta and Open Banking recently. We saw solutions for more vulnerable customers spotting when there was a change in payment patterns, transactions being different, and flagging that to a carer or guardian. And you can do the same kind of thing in the business area, in the energy area as well, because you can sort of spot behavioural changes at household level when you're reading smart meter data. Now, those are very similar challenges to the ones that you would encounter if you were setting up access into your personal bank account in terms of the consents required. So we can see a lot of similarities there. But what it starts to reveal is that by merging data sets that look at transactional data and your behavior within your household measured through your smart meter, you could start to create services for more vulnerable people, maintain their independence, make sure that they're okay, and keep an eye on them. So some really good societal benefits, I think, in play as well. Faith.
So I'm just going to take a little sidestep, actually, Miles, because you introduced the value of data in helping people who are experiencing vulnerable circumstances. And Harry, I wanted to just ask you, in terms of thinking about smart data, how are you seeing vulnerable people in terms of that agenda? What are you thinking about there?
Yeah, so I think that we're really keen that vulnerable consumers, and as any consumer, should be sort of central to smart data initiatives. And interesting that you brought up the Open Up challenge there. So we've proposed that there should be similar vulnerable consumer challenges running alongside the introduction of further smart data initiatives. And I think timing is important here, because these initiatives need to be a certain level of development before those challenge funds can add real value, but definitely something that we have proposed as government and will consider in future. And I think in general on smart data, we're trying to bring the different sectors together to share resources and lessons learned. And I think quite a lot is happening at the sector level to engage with users more generally and around vulnerability.
That's great. Really important to kind of get that consumer voice into the sort of development of the ecosystem. Just sort of as I kind of think about my experience on open banking, and also thinking about how do we ensure things work well for consumers, one of the things that's really important is that trust framework and the governance that sits around it, and that's important for consumers in understanding liability and where do they get redress, and who's working, sort of being clear about who's responsible for making the consumer whole. But the other angle is also ensuring a trust system for businesses, so they know who to trust and who they are allowed to share data with. So sort of thinking about who sets the bar for engaging in the ecosystem and who's responsible for policing it is really important, and definitely something I've been thinking about in terms of my work with Icebreaker One. Simon, I wanted to come to you in terms of this point. What do you think is required to open up data successfully, and what do you think we can learn from open banking in that respect? What are the kind of key components that we could take for open banking and deploy elsewhere?
It's really interesting, Faith, the point that you raise as well. I mean, unfortunately, I have the experience on my hands of working through regulations like FATCA and going through PSD1 in banking and a little bit of touch on Basel. And the problem with all those regulations was they were deserved to the bank, they were delivered, and then the bank interpreted them. And that's not their fault. The fundamental difference in open banking is it's a standard. So you got told a benchmark to achieve. Now, from that, your variance is much greater. What you can deliver is much greater because everybody is starting from the absolute same point. You talked about vulnerable adults before. One of the biggest challenges to get to a vulnerable adult, to get to a vulnerable population, is flexibility. Because if you prescribe one service, you automatically exclude an awful lot of people. So you have to have a wider range. You can only do that if you begin with a level playing field. And the level playing field, and what I personally believe, is one of the fundamentals of open banking to success, and any open data standard is a standard. It's having something that a range of people can connect to in the same way, or use in the same way, consume in the same way, and so many things come from that. We talked about protection then, and about the different levels of business protection, purchase protection, consumer. And if we think about protections as well, they all come from one thing, a standard again, which is the two traditional card standards. If we give the look of that, of the MasterCard rules and the Visa rules, and then we've got the MV in the middle of it, but they're all from a standard. So we have that platform, and that's critical. It is, for me, the absolute launch point of anything that can grow at scale, that can deliver true value. Because if everybody's starting from the same place, then your branches go out. But if you all start from different places, you tend to find that people try to solve the same problem in 24 different ways. Or worse than that, they don't try to solve some of the problems at all. Now, you couple that with something very powerful. We're vanguards with everything in our life except our money. So if we ask many of the people listening to this webinar today who they bank with, there'll be a lot of commonality that they'll bank with a lot of the bigger banks, yet they work in the banking industry. I've done this a few times when I've spoken as well. So we're quite cautious with our money. And so we need trust. And trust means we need adoption by big brands, big businesses, and big organizations, and people that will allow us to use something and consume it. The best one on the marketplace is the UK government, our own government, whichever territory you're in. If your government uses something, we automatically believe that if it's fiscally used, it's trusted. And that's important. So trust is not just generated by a relationship, it's generated by precedent. So the two things that are absolutely critical for me, if you draw out, if you want to share data and you want to get adoption, and we all want adoption, every fintech wants a population. That's their wants, that's what they need. The standards are a critical point for it to grow from. They are Jack's bean. They will take it up to the sky. And the trust between people adopting it and having that framework to build from is absolutely what is the key to success. I'll pass back to you, Faith. I hope that answers the question.
That's great, Simon. I think it sort of just begins to lay the groundwork really for Gavin to perhaps come in and talk to me about, you know, these different aspects of trust and what the read across to Open Energy is.
Certainly. Well, I think it's worth commenting as well on this idea of trust versus the word open, because they don't always necessarily go together, and they can equally amplify each other. And I want to reflect just before we start on why is it called the Open Banking Standard? Fundamentally, it's about opening up the marketplace around banking services and encouraging interoperability across banking and beyond. So it's an open standard that enables interoperability at web scale. And this idea of web scale is critically important to this. It's not just about a consumer data right. It's not just about a particular implementation. It's a fundamentally different way of behaving as a market. And I think, as was said earlier, you know, this was the first time we'd really codified the way that the web already works into a regulatory framework. And I want to build on that a little bit here as we go towards the open energy conversation. Tech companies are now the richest companies on earth. They've got a 20-year lead on most other sectors because they've embraced open APIs and creating, if you like, the service interfaces from the ground up to be externalizable, so they can be interoperable by default. The thing that the Open Banking Standard achieves is a mandate to make that happen. And this is part of the friction in the current sort of legacy businesses or legacy business models, is that there's a huge tendency to say, well, let's aggregate first. If we can get hold of all the data, we can build our own data lake, and then we can work out what the business model is. From my perspective, that's the wrong strategy. And it will result, and we've seen it result in huge investment in what I would call stagnant data lakes. The flip side of that is to treat data as a continuous flow of evidence that informs action. And the question there is, and how do we enable as many people to interface with that information as possible? Now, it's quite straightforward or relatively straightforward with open data. You pick the things that are benign and from bus timetables to the Human Genome Project, where you want a huge number of people to access, but we've got highly sensitive information that needs to be accessed here, ranging from national security around critical infrastructure to individual smart meter data in the energy sector. And so you need a trust framework to enable and give confidence to the market that data sharing is possible. The inertia is a critical blocker in existing businesses, and it's very difficult for chief data officers and CTOs to really push forward on that interoperability front when they're dealing with so many challenges and issues. And we saw this in banking as well. There was a huge amount of legacy infrastructure and a huge cost of transformation to people to update their systems. But that has to happen. And the mandate here is really critical. So when we look at the role of what regulation can be here is to act as a forcing function. We do need a mandate to come out from different parts of our public sector, whether that's through procurement or through regulation, to force the interoperability question. It doesn't really matter what technologies get used. Again, it's not a technology question, but certainly the interoperability piece. And when we then look at energy, there's thousands. We've identified over 9,000 companies in the energy sector just in the UK. How are we going to enable all of those actors to engage with the information flows in a secure and trusted manner? And then what are the benefits? And then as we're looking at everything from measuring carbon intensity of energy flow across that grid to the diversification of energy supply and demand with renewables, into how do we then span into other sectors like transport, electric vehicles, and so on. There's a huge complexity there. And from my perspective, the only way, the only architectural solution there is to create an open energy standard which can provide that trust framework for sharing and disaggregate the question of data governance from the specific data payloads that have to flow across the network.
Well, thank you, Gavin. Really sort of taken by the relationship between kind of trust and familiarity, sort of a level playing field where multiple entities can come and provide services, and the kind of concept of interoperability and how those things connect. And I guess for me, sorry, just because I see lots of different dots, one of the spaces where they really connect is around the consent journey, especially if you're an individual providing consent. You want to have that journey which is consistent and familiar across all providers. You want to be able to interact with multiple providers without being told, oh, well, this provider doesn't allow you to share your data, or this provider doesn't accept your data. And you want to have that sort of sense of trust that actually when you do share your data, you know that the entity you're sharing with is trusted and trustworthy. So Miles, you and I have written about this, and just as a bit of a plug, if you are watching this and you would like to understand more about consent and liability and redress, please do have a Google on the Smart Data government website. Look for their research associated with smart data. Miles and I have both written. But Miles, can you tell us a little bit about consent and how perhaps it draws these different themes together?
Yeah, thanks, Faith. I think actually we're at a sort of a change in the way that consumers think about what they do with their personal data. One of the things we've learned from open banking is that as they start to understand the value of the data that they got and what can be done with that, then they start to get much more interested in that whole process around consent. and the sort of the penny drops really about they need to be in charge, and they'd really like to know a little bit more about how their data is being used. And in open banking, we did a lot of work on that. We understood through the research that we ran exactly what people felt about it. And what we concluded from that was that actually, first of all, it needs to be a much easier customer journey, and it needs to be familiar. And that same principle will need to run through all other sectors as well. There's a fundamental to the consumer, really, is that if you can make this a familiar customer journey where they get used to seeing the same kind of language and the same kind of approach to providing their consent, that will be incredibly useful in assisting with adoption. And what people are really starting to question here is if they're going to share their data, what is going to happen to that data? Why are they doing it in the first place? What's the purpose? How long is it going to be shared for? And they really want to understand specifically what type of data is going to be shared. This is coming back from the work that we did over the last 2 or 3 years, actually, and always very consistent once people understood what was going on here. So as this becomes a more familiar part of our lives, and we use more of these online services, then so consent is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. So it is really something that needs to be applied so that it is a common approach across sectors. And I really hope that this becomes something that gets bedded in as a result of the smart data initiatives, the work that's going on at the moment.
Thanks, Miles. That's really, really helpful. And Harriet, I guess, what would you say that governments learn from all of this experience of open banking, and where do you expect to take things next?
Sure. Well, I think government can learn a lot from open banking, and it links to a lot of what's already been said, I suppose. I mean, firstly, around what Simon was saying about the standard, meaning everyone was at the same starting place. We're seeing a lot of similar initiatives being developed, led by regulators, so Open Finance, Open Communications, My Data in the energy sector, and they're being developed looking at specific sectors, and there's a risk that they're not only duplicating work, but then taking divergent approaches, which will mean we end up with a series of initiatives that might not talk to each other, which goes against all the interoperability benefits which we've been talking about. So part of the reason why we've set up a smart data working group, which brings together these initiatives and is looking at some of the particularly thorny issues, including consent, building on Faith and Miles' research reports, but working through not only how things like consent and authentication can be taken forward, but also where they can be standardized across sectors, and it's so that things can be sort of as similar as possible for that starting point, like we were saying. I think another big thing that we've learned from open banking and feedback from those involved is that mandating participation was a key step in sort of enabling open banking to really take off, which is why government announced in September plans to introduce primary legislation to better enable similar smart data initiatives to be established, helping reduce sort of regulatory duplication and also accelerate the introduction of new schemes. And the sector context will still be central before sort of this legislation is put into place, but knowing that legislation is there, I think we just really encourage that industry gets involved and engaged with the initiatives as early as possible to help sort of shape the landscape in which they will eventually play a key role.
That's great. Thank you very much, Harriet. And I guess we need to start thinking about wrapping up this panel. And I'd just like to thank our audience for listening. But just kind of coming out to the panel then for a final comment from each of you, what's the kind of key thing that you'd like to get across to our audience, or the key thing you'd recommend industries learn from open banking and the emerging experience of open energy for other initiatives? Perhaps we'll start with Gavin.
Thank you. So I think firstly to embrace and engage with the process of interoperability at scale. I think we need to get past the idea that somehow aggregating all the information and building, centralized systems are good for business. They're not, and we need to focus on the ecosystem around us, from which we will create reciprocal business value. The second component of this from an industry perspective is to start with user needs. The narrower the use case to really drill through particular applications, the easier it is for people to understand and engage with and actually see what the value is. And then drawing out of that, what are the common principles and practice from an operational point of view, from a policy and regulatory point of view, and from a technical point of view, are incredibly valuable. And what we've seen in the translation of open banking across to open energy is most of those principles and practice do translate, particularly around the governance pieces. So again, it's about disaggregating the problem into its constituent parts such that we can then apply those principles across the market and across different sectors to enable cross-sector interoperability. So I think that my call to action there is just to engage in the process and really lean in to that to help us unlock value both for businesses today, to help the transformation of existing industries, and help our innovation landscape across the country.
That's great, thank you, Gavin. Miles, what are your thoughts?
Well, certainly, and it's been very interesting seeing just how open banking principles and the approach map over to open energy, and just what an opportunity there is really that we can open up. And from that, what I would say is, there is such a fantastic opportunity to innovate and exercise our creativity across the ecosystem in solving some of these really quite pressing problems that we have at the moment, relating first of all to climate change, but also the driving economic growth and recovery from COVID-19. This feels like an open goal for us, and we should really be going for it. And I would encourage anybody with a mind to think about solving problems and delivering propositions into the energy sector who's already hard at work in the open banking side. Then take a look at it and as Gavin was saying, engage and let's see what we might be able to do together.
And thank you, Miles, really helpful. Simon?
I think that Gavin alluded to it before, that the word is open. There's lots of advancements in this world that are done in secret behind closed doors, where huge corporations sit there and hide and say, well, we must do it on our own, we've got to stay isolated, and the time for that's gone. There's so much value to be taken from what's happening in open banking. It can be proven around the world. There's so much value that we can see if we look on the headland, we look on the horizon to open energy. And if we look for the one that's the real game changer that should come to the party, it's either the device manufacturers or the mobile phone networks, because we are a mobile first society for however long that lasts at the moment. And I do agree that the data value is some building a lake is not any kind of a commercial proposition or a value proposition to anybody, but there's a lot there that should be talked about and aggregated. There's a lot there that should be explored. There's a lot there that should be found. So my message is one really clear one. We need to talk about it with industries. We need them to start talking to people who've done it, open banking. Miles, Gavin, they've done it with energy. It's starting. This is the start of a whole new change across the globe, I feel. And I think we need to talk about the emergence and make sure we make the right steps and don't make the mistakes others have made.
That's some sage advice there. Thank you, Simon. And Harriet, what was your closing comment?
I think I've probably alluded to this already, but just when initiatives are being developed in individual sectors, and we should really think about the opportunities that interoperability across further sectors could enable. So it's not just making sure that the plumbing exists, but how can you really capitalise on that and make better initiatives as a result.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much to the panel. So I guess I'm hearing, I sense, is this need for dialogue and for conversation about where we should be opening up data, how we can make data and the sharing of data much more consistent across different sectors, how we can drive into use cases, solve challenging societal problems and, for my part, consumer problems, but also think about sort of the interoperability and how we make sure that plumbing is effective across the sectors too. So just to say, really, thank you very much to Gavin, to Miles, Harriet and Simon. Really appreciated your contributions today. And I'm going to hand back now to Kelly, who's going to lead the Q&A. So thanks, everybody. Hi there, everybody, and thanks for listening to our panel discussion. It's great to be here again today to take your questions. So please just encourage you, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat to let us know. But I'm going to kickstart. We've already received some. So I'm just going to come out to you first, Gavin. So I think you spoke about legacy systems and interoperability as being key elements that other sectors can learn from open banking. Are there other factors that you would say are key that should be considered?
Sure. Well, I think that legacy systems encompass both technology and processes and operational systems and culture. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on helping to train people on what these new ways of working are and embracing them in day-to-day operations. I think one of the ways of doing that is to really pick quite narrow use cases and then work with the data value chain so that people can see the real impact of better data sharing in their own work. So if you're producing data, connecting more closely with the people who are users of that information is actually quite inspiring, because you get to understand better, what people are actually doing at the other end of that chain. And likewise, that can stimulate conversations about, what additional data supplies might be useful. So I think that there's a broader piece here about culture change in shifting from quite siloed approaches to much more joined up sort of silo busting approaches, which underpins what the open banking standard does. It helps the whole ecosystem move forward in a way that's much more shared. But the sharing isn't just about the data, it's about lots of other dimensions as well.
Cool, thank you, Gavin. Miles, do you want to expand? What are some of these other aspects?
So I think one of the things around interoperability is the role of the directory that has been so successful in open banking, and that we can see a fundamental role for in open energy. Being able to understand who the participants are in the ecosystem, whether or not you've ever dealt with them before, to be able to do away with bilateral contracts, have a much more seamless way of accessing data. That's absolutely critical. We can really move away from the old way of doing things and accelerate data sharing if we've got this common approach to governance. And I think that's a critical aspect.
That's great. Is there any anything that you'd like to add to that, Simon, just by way of terms of what you've learned from open banking that we could sort of add to that?
I think you've got to look at the legacy landscape of the technology for a lot of the banking players was quite old. They were developed over many, many years. There's been quite a lot of challenges in replatforming, and you can't dismiss those challenges as well. So for me, one of the things that open banking did that was quite key was the order gave us the CMA9, and getting those guys into a room first of all to be able to access their data was key. Maybe what you could have done, or which we have done as the implementation entity has matured, is to get more of the biggest stakeholders in the room as well, because if they can talk to each other at the very simple level, then you can share the data. And the power of the data is not just about accessing one set, it's about aggregating them as well. So getting those stakeholders in the room, deferring to what Miles has just said about the directory, I think that's key, having a safe place for them to be identified as well. But there's an awful lot of old technology that's got to talk to each other and talk to a lot of new technology. And thankfully, the new technology allows that. The role of the translator is the critical point there for me. And if you can aggregate it, you can do an awful lot more with the data.
Thanks, Simon. Hannah, Harriet, sorry, I'm going to come straight out to you next. We've got another question here, just in terms of customer uptake of open data in the energy sector. So we've seen the growth in open banking, but obviously it's been reasonably slow. It's now beginning to kind of take off. Do you think we see something similar in other sectors? And how would you go about solving the adoption curve and marketing the benefits?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a big one as well, because I think this is probably the biggest assumption that we have sort of underpinning the benefits of smart data, is that the products produce things that customers will use, and the framework will be something that third parties can build upon. So like you say, sort of open banking provides a concrete example of increasing and accelerating uptake for these types of services. And I think COVID-19 as well, we've seen an increasing reliance on data-driven services. Looking at energy specifically, Ofgem carried out user research to test a proof of concept for My Data, which is in effect smart data in the energy sector, focused on tariff comparisons. And some key findings that they found there would be benefit and some demand for these services. But what was interesting is that there was a real need for familiarity for customers. So really, they just want to know that the process will be quick, easy, and accurate. So while customer uptake will be crucial, I think there's a lot of work to get the groundwork right to make sure that we can sort of enable these secure and successful initiatives in the first place.
That's great. And so we've got another question here, which I'll come up to as well. We've got Gavin, and then maybe Simon, you could have a look at this one as well, just really around, when you've got so many companies in the UK, especially sort of data. I think you mentioned sort of 9,000 energy companies in the UK. Do you think it's possible to create a common standard so that open data can take off? What are the elements that we need to create this sort of ecosystem and free-flowing sharing of data?
So it's a really good question. So I think that the approach needs to be to break it up into smaller individual components. So firstly, let's put in place the trust framework that enables people to know that they're dealing with the organizations that they're thinking with. That's core to the directory approach. Secondly, let's work out what the common rules are around data rights and what the design patterns are for data utilization. And then I think drilling into specific use cases then will help unpack each of those different questions. That's what we've done with the Open Energy work. And if you go to energydata.org.uk, you'll see a use case there that shows quite how complex this whole ecosystem is. But I think there that what we see is there's common frameworks here. There are then that absolutely translate from open banking to open energy. But then there's specific differences. So for example, there is no one data set no one API that's going to meet all use cases. That would be broadly impossible. But you can say you should have an API and you should have a trust framework and a standardized kind of contractual framework around that to enable the sharing of data once we know what everybody wants to do with that particular information. So I think there's an infinity of use cases, but there are common design patterns that we can focus in on that can be addressed across the whole market. So I'd break it out into, we could agree a common open energy standard, which effectively are the rules of engagement. And then within that, it splits into probably 3 different categories. If you look at open data, we can agree collectively that we should publish open data around certain categories. We should definitely be publishing open data of the metadata that describes the data we're holding. There's a second component then around shared data, which is where you absolutely need the trust framework to provide preemptive licensing and conditional access across the market, where there is a market need for that, where you've got a many-to-many relationship. And then there's a third category where the particular data involved may only be needed between 3 or 4 organizations. You don't need a huge data infrastructure to deliver that. That can just be done with bilateral contracts as it's being done today. So I think there's a kind of triage process that we can go through, but underpinning all of this is a common trust framework.
Oh, thanks, Gavin. So, Simon, have you got any comments on this concept of, standardizing? How far can we take standards, and where do we need to actually just accept that it might be too much and may not deliver the intended benefits?
Well, I think the key word, I think Gavin's just articulated perfectly there, the structure that needs to be built around and what makes it work. But for me, it's about benefits. If we work from the other end and we look at, number one, the stakeholders that will benefit. So we identify what they are, what benefits they will realize, and what use cases will deliver those benefits. Because it would be quite futile to build something that doesn't have benefits at the end of it, and they're not necessarily commercial. There's an awful lot of benefits there that are social, that are economic as well. So I think you work backwards. What you say is what's the population that's going to consume my service? who are the populations that benefit, what are the use cases that deliver those benefits, and then work backwards to say, well, this is what we need as an MVP, as a minimum viable proposition, to say this is the data we would need to be able to access to do that. And if you do that, what you're doing is you're addressing a market need. And again, that market need might not be commercial. I think Gavin made a very, very good point there as well about that the holding of that, the trust framework that's around it is very important. So yeah, identify the benefits, and I think it works, Faith.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for the questions. I'm a little aware of time and we've probably taken you over, and I don't want to stop you from getting to your next session. So just to say thank you very much to the panel, some really interesting sort of discussion really around those different sorts of aspects of culture, digitization, the trust framework, which seems to be very kind of important in the middle of all that. And then just sort of thinking about the rules of engagement and what is it we need in order to deliver those benefits, getting those getting the groundwork done properly. There's loads out there to learn on this subject, so I just encourage you to have a look at the Energy Data website, have a look at the work that BEIS is doing, and engage where you can. So thanks very much, guys, and away from all of our speakers, and we'll see you again in future. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.